to an incorporated town, a Catholic diocese, and a school district for 500 children. Boys Town has cash reserves of $500 million, but still raises up to $35 million annually, solicited from the public by begging letters and promotional videos.
I'm Father Val Peters, caretaker of Father Flanagan Stream and the executive director of Boys Town. Does Boys Town really exist, people ask me? You bet it does.
Located in the heartland of America, Boys Town youth have come from many backgrounds and locales. As they graduate, they shall seek new adventures and head for different places. But always, they shall carry with them the spirit of Boys Town. If you'd like to help Boys Town, send your tax-deductible gift to Father Val Peter, Boys Town, Nebraska, 68010.
Boys Town, for me, was the first thing I ever heard of when you think of institutions that you respect. Believe it or not, I was there for a while when I was a young boy. When an institution like that gets contaminated, then you better, if you've got any decency at all, do something about it, or at least get it cleared up.
John DeCamp lays the blame for the contamination of Boys Town on the one-time leader of the National Black Republican Council, Larry King.
Larry King was the fastest rising black star in the entire Republican Party of all of the 1980s. And he was also one of the most evil individuals in this country in terms of being a dealer of children, in terms of being a thief, 40 million that they documented he stole, and in terms of using and compromising and corrupting one after another politicians.
The base for his network was the Franklin Federal Credit Union, a people's bank in Omaha, Nebraska. Larry King was its general manager.
Thank you. This is especially an exciting day for me.
Mr. King was a very charismatic person. When he came to the credit union, he was brought in because the credit union was actually failing. He did everything to build the credit union.
King courted the leaders of Omaha's wealthy business district. Banks, industry, and charities placed millions of dollars in King's hands. From 1979, Larry King developed close commercial ties to Boys Town, and Boys Town youngsters were sent to work for his companies.
Boys Town had quite a few accounts at Franklin Credit Union. Those were considered very valuable accounts. They were handled exclusively by the bookkeeping department. But on the average of once a month or once every 2 months, we always seemed to incorporate a person from Boys Town.
But King used Boys Town not just as a source of young boys for his business. He prostituted them at sex and drug orgies. Paul Benassi was a victim of King's abuse. He was also sent by King to lure Boys Town youngsters off campus.
We used to just drive around and go up toward the home. That's when we used to do some of the scavenger hunts with picking up some of the kids. You know, just kind of win their confidence, become friends with them for a while. Start inviting them to the parties. The kids were 10 years old or older.
In 1986, King's plundering of Boys Town was reported by staff to its chief executive, Father Val Peter. Subsequent testimony proves that he carried out his own investigation, but that King's victims refused to talk to him. Monsignor Hupp now blames himself for Boys Town's association with Larry King.
Well, in retrospect, I regret having any association with Larry King. Had I known it at the time, it would never have happened.
Could you understand why a very detailed report from a social worker employed at Boys Town, identifying children and identifying their alleged abusers, never saw the light of day? Nothing happened with that.
No, I couldn't understand that, because had I known that, I wouldn't put up with that. But is that something like that happened? I don't know.
Nebraska has a very clear statute that child abuse allegations should be reported to authorities. They shouldn't be reported to the principal of a school, director of a facility. They should be reported directly to either Child Protective Services or law enforcement.
And so Larry King remained free to feed his pedophilic parties with child victims. But in 1988, a routine review brought King's involvement with Boys Town youth to the attention of Nebraska's State Foster Care Review Board.
In the information presented to the Foster Care Review Board, either the telephone reports, the personal reports, or the reports we reviewed, Larry King's name was consistently present as someone that the youth were making allegations against. So I would say we handed over at least a foot-high amount of material to authorities, and nothing happened.
Omaha police now accept that Larry King may have been abusing children.
Good morning, Roberta.
But its most senior officer claims the evidence was not conclusive.
It is certainly possible that Mr. King was involved in illegal acts with children. If there was sufficient evidence of those types of allegations, he would have been prosecuted by the county attorney's office.
For me, it was very clear that the case was not investigated and not pursued because of the alleged perpetrators.
Those perpetrators, named by the children, were some of the richest and most influential citizens in positions of power in the state. Men prominent in industry, politics, the media, even the police. We can only name the ringleaders. Besides Larry King, they were department store millionaire Alan Baer and the celebrity columnist of Omaha's only newspaper, the World Herald, Peter Citron. With the judicial system apparently paralyzed, Larry King spent Franklin's money on courting political influence. $10 million went on jewelry, flowers, and private planes. He cultivated contacts in the inner circles of Ronald Reagan's White House. At his palatial homes, 3 in Omaha and 1 in Washington, D.C., he held extravagant parties for the influential and powerful. His lavish spending bought him a protected life.
Larry King was constantly heralded, cheered, applauded in the news media as the great businessman that's helping the poor people, the black community of Omaha.
But King's extravagance attracted the attention of the Internal Revenue Service. As a result, on April the 11th, 1988, the Franklin Credit Union was raided and closed by the FBI. King was arrested, and the federal investigation showed he had stolen $40 million from Franklin. Documents we possess reveal the FBI interviewed many of the victims of Larry King's sex ring, but no action was taken. In November 1988, Nebraska's state government set up a parallel investigation into Larry King. A legislative committee was formed. Its chairman was the Republican head of Nebraska's Banking Committee, corn farmer and state senator Lawrence Schmidt. Immediately, anonymous threats began.
I received a phone call on the floor of the legislature. The caller did not identify himself, but he said, "Lauren, you do not want to have an investigation of the Franklin Federal Credit Union." And I asked who I was speaking to, and they said, "That doesn't matter, but you shouldn't have that investigation." And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "It will reach to the highest levels of the Republican Party, and we're both good Republicans."
Undeterred, the committee began their investigations, and the money trail led quickly to the original allegations of child abuse. Carolyn Stitt was one of the first to testify.
The night before we testified before the legislative committee, I did receive a phone call at home that said, "If you speak, you won't live to regret it."
To protect the inquiry, Schmidt's committee hired special legal counsel and full-time professional investigators Gary Caradori and Karen Ormiston.
I said, "We do not want you to bring to the committee rumors, innuendos, nothing that cannot be backed up with facts. I said, bring to the committee that which we can take to a prosecutor.
The investigators found new victims of King's pedophile network, many on the streets of Omaha. The picture they built up was of a large ring of rich and powerful pedophiles, many named the same men as those involved with the Boys Town cases 3 years earlier.
They were telling us about prominent people in Omaha and elsewhere that were abusing children at parties.
The prominent citizens' names that originally came up were of concern to me because I knew many of those individuals, and I very frankly was shocked to have those names show up on the list.
To provide the committee with hard evidence, the investigators recorded their new witnesses on videotape. Paul Bonacci had been the victim of abuse since he was 8. He was present at many of Larry King's sex parties. Caradori traced him to the county jail. He had been convicted of fondling his young cousin.
Who were some of these people that would come to these parties? Larry King, Peter Citron, Wilson Fire. He didn't seem like good about that.
Media personality Peter Citron procured some of his victims from Boys Town.
The kids he liked were mainly around the age of probably about 8 and 13. It was mainly fondling and oral sex with them. He did have some anal sex, but he usually did that with the older kids.
The parties involved ever more sadistic abuse.
Whenever you were tied up, was there anybody else present other than you, Peter Citron? Yes. Who was that? Alan Bear.
Millionaire Alan Bear hosted parties for a large number of sadistic pedophiles. Paul Bonacci suffered at their hands.
Okay. Yeah. They tied me up and had some other kids perform sex on me, and they came to me and they found me some cigarettes. Okay. Just take a deep breath now. And cross the Troy Bonner. Troy Bonner would tie you up? Who was that?
Troy Bonner was found by the investigators and his videotape testimony taken under oath.
I was shocked when I walked in. There was a kid, I would say about 15 years old, out in the middle of the room. One guy was standing in front of him. He was bent over, and the other guy was like reaching under him, playing with his nipples, while a guy whom Jeff told me was a police officer shoving beads up his rectum.
The police officer was shoving beads up his rectum?
Yes.
Bonner named Alan Bear as the man who introduced him to the sex parties.
Alan Bear was a sick fuck. Didn't care, wanted sex, nasty, I don't even know if you can call it sex. Everything, from just, touching to fruit, squash, huge squash, that big around, stuck into your ass, heat things, hot things, poked at you and stuck in you.
But the center of the child sex ring was Larry King.
Larry King was the same kind of sick fuck Alan Bear was, except Larry King was more violent, more sure of himself. I got those scars on my arm one night at a party where Larry King, wanted to see how strong a man we were or something, and have us push our arms together, and then you'd light cigarettes, and as soon as you get burning, you just drop them down between your arms and, let it burn. And they made us stand there naked and touch each other by holding our arms together and burn cigarettes. It's on film someplace. They filmed it. Burning, I would, see him fuck a 10-year-old boy in the ass, until he bled and, just pull out and stop and, push him down, and then go out and, meet with decent people.
King would also provide underage girls for abuse. Alicia Owen told the investigators she was 15 when she attended her first party, introduced by a Boys Town boy. Caridori discovered her in jail where she was serving a sentence for passing bad checks.
I met some guys there that were from Boys Town, and it was at that party that I met Larry King. At the time that I met Larry King, I did not know that he was Larry King. I had met him. It was the first time I'd ever met him.
Larry King and Alan Baer frequently hosted the child sex parties in penthouse apartments at the Twin Towers luxury block in Omaha.
A lot of it was me handcuffed with my hands behind my head and my feet tied and doing different things.
What do you mean?
Sometimes there'd be a guy straddling over my face.
Okay.
Most of the time, Larry King took pictures quite a bit during that time.
I know it's difficult.
I don't know.
Okay.
And I think I could have said no.
Okay.
But I don't know.
Okay. And Alicia, you're a victim. And at a young age, let's go off camera for a minute.
We were appalled. Appalled. I don't even know if it comes across on the video, the way it came across to us in person. It was incredible. It's incredible what these kids went through, I think.
Larry King was also here. He came in and we drank and did cocaine. I didn't do much. He turned me on to what Larry King did.
Drugs was a strong part of how they got control of some of the kids, because that's what some of the kids were there to get. They would do the sexual acts and then be provided with cocaine or whatever type of drug they wanted.
Heroin, I don't know, but that was my drug of choice. Till this day, I remained an addict.
And those of us that didn't like to be involved and didn't want to be involved were threatened.
And who would do these threatening remarks?
Larry King.
You think Larry King personally did?
I think he did. And when they threatened, that I can go find somebody that will kill you, and it will kill your family, he didn't tell anybody.
Larry King was, I would say, the center of transporting country. The airplanes were usually in his name, leased in his name. They were paid for by Larry King.
We met them in Pasadena.
Met who in Pasadena?
We met Larry King was there. There was 3 boys that I had seen at one of the receptions at the French Cafe were there. And I'm almost positive they were Boys Town boys. Almost positive. They were there.
You mean graduates of Boys Town or present?
I think they were present because they were young.
Well, how would they get away for a long period of time?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Boys Town came up frequently during the investigation, but we found it very difficult to get information about Boys Town. I was not able to find any information on my visit there, and Mr. Caridori could not get information either.
Boys Town today remains unwilling to discuss its involvement with Larry King. We were banned from filming at Boys Town, and its public affairs officer refused any interviews.
I would have to give you a flat no. I'm just going to tell you at this point that we will not participate with you. We have no interest in talking to you folks. It's something that we don't even care to delve into.
By the spring of 1990, the Nebraska State Committee was convinced by the evidence of an organized child abuse ring. Its chairman, Lawrence Schmidt, John DeCamp. On his advice, Schmidt turned over all the sworn evidence to the FBI. But immediately, the videotape testimony was leaked to a hostile local media.
The media immediately started discrediting the witnesses. They were, the witnesses came across in the media, in the Omaha World Herald, especially, as the criminals.
The last 3 victim witnesses were demolished by the press, particularly the Omaha World Herald. The paper never looked for information that would support any of the allegations. The whole purpose of the stories was to destroy any credibility that these youth may have.
I've heard that people said that Gary Caradori coached me and that he told me what to say, but the fact was I didn't meet Gary Caradori until way after I'd already talked to the Omaha police about the abuse and had named all the same people.
Paul Benassi maintains that neither the FBI nor the Omaha police took his allegations seriously.
And they didn't ask me very much about Larry King or even Alan Baer at all. They treated the allegations that I made about the like a joke.
The stories were of such significance that the investigators first wanted to prove the accuracy of the stories. As they set about the investigation of the initially three, and then a 4th person who were telling the stories, as the investigation developed, it became obvious to the investigators that the information was not accurate, that in fact it was an entire conspiracy of allegations, none of which had any truth to them.
I was very disappointed with the way the FBI and law enforcement treated the victims. They, in fact, turned them into the offenders, so to speak. And instead of taking the evidence that was delivered to them by the victims and interrogating the persons whom the victims identified, they seemed to bear down and try to get the victims to change their story.
It seemed to the investigators that the establishment of Omaha was closing ranks. Then Troy Bonner was brought in for questioning by the FBI.
The FBI's attitude was, just no, these kind of things don't happen. From the first interview when I went, and realized they don't believe a fucking thing I'm saying, they were just appalled. But I realized what that look in their eye was back then. It was fear. It was fear of it, I had witnessed, firsthand things that would, destroy this city, people, or position, what I mean? It's not going to be believed, they said. It will not be believed. You will be found guilty of perjury, and they weren't telling me maybe. There's no way. You go on with this story, you're going to jail. That was said to me direct.
Troy Bonner agreed to withdraw his videotape testimony. The FBI used Troy in an attempt to persuade fellow witness Alicia Owen into abandoning her evidence about Larry King's nationwide network of powerful pedophiles. We have obtained the recording of a phone call made by the FBI on March the 9th, 1990. It is significant evidence for John DeCamp.
This is Special Agent Michael F. Mott. Following will be a consensually recorded telephone call between Troy Bonner and Alicia Owen.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, what's going on?
I'd like to ask you that.
Talk to me.
No, you talk to me. I don't understand why you're lying. Why are you lying?
What are you talking about?
That's what I'm asking you.
You're calling me why I'm lying?
Yeah.
You can talk to this whole thing, Alicia.
You're full of shit.
Either tell me what's going on.
You're full of shit.
Hey, look.
Who do you have listening on this line?
I have nobody listening to me. I'm listening to you, and I'm hoping you give me some fucking answers.
I'll be honest with you. I don't know what kind of game you're playing.
I'm not trying to play a game. I'm not going to go to jail for you. And that's what's going to happen.
Why would you go to jail? Jail for telling the truth?
No, jail for lying.
What have you lied about?
I haven't lied.
Okay, but why are...
Listen, shut up. Listen to me. You're not out here being talked to them every day. The pressure's kind of hard.
You literally have to have bricks for brains to take on the FBI in this country. And that's exactly what you'd have to do this properly. They now, in my opinion, in my investigation, are the architects of the cover-up.
We asked the FBI in Omaha for an interview about its investigation of the Franklin scandal.
Larry Holmquist with the FBI here. We feel it would be inappropriate for us to comment. We work this with the Omaha Police Department. We just don't feel it would be appropriate for us to make comments.
As the investigators sought out new witnesses, they found themselves under constant threat.
Gary was threatened several times. His vehicles were tampered with. I would think whoever tampered with them, it was a scare tactic because it was so obvious that they were being tampered with.
Gary there was one piece of evidence I know he got that he even said he got one step ahead of him this time. He told us about this book. It was like addresses, telephone numbers, names. He said if they knew you had it, they'd kill him.
On July the 11th, 1990, Gary Caradori and his 8-year-old son AJ were flying home from Chicago in his light aircraft. They had watched the All-Star baseball game, and Caradori had been pursuing new leads.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are in Harold Cameron's cornfield trying to determine what caused this private plane to crash, killing its 2 occupants.
The bodies of Gary Caradori and 8-year-old AJ were found in the wreckage.
National Transportation Safety Board investigators say wreckage from the crash is apparently strewn over a 3/4 to 1 mile long stretch in this field.
The fact that the wreckage is scattered over a large area certainly demonstrates that it did break up in flight. The exact mechanism of breakup yet is still unknown.
The federal investigation was never able to discover what tore the plane apart.
There are things missing from the plane. His briefcase is missing. I think the plane was sabotaged. There's no doubt in my mind.
Within 24 hours of the tragedy, all Caradori's records were impounded by the FBI. Gary's widow Sandy is still unable to come to terms with her loss.
As a mother, I don't want to ever think that somebody murdered my child, let alone my husband. But I think if you'd ever talk to any parent, be it mother or father, that's ever lost a child, I mean, the worst thing that you can think of is that somebody would want to murder a child.
I really feel that somebody killed my brother. And inside me, I know that somebody killed my brother. If somebody could help us out somewhere, somebody knows something. And may God help those who did that to him and his family.
The effect of Gary's crash on the investigation, I think, in effect, put an end to anybody else coming forward. There are many victims. We knew of more. There are more. They're still out there. They're afraid to come forward.
That's when I was finished, because I figured out if they murdered Gary and his son, there was nothing that would stop them. There was no piece of paper. There was nothing we could come up with that was going to get anything done.
But Gary Caradori's death pricked Troy Bonner's conscience. He promised Sandy that he would tell Senator Schmidt's committee about the FBI's pressure which led him to lie.
I set the record straight. I was, going to do it. And would, the truth would come out, and somebody would be held accountable for his death. And then at the funeral I had seen, the FBI guys, and they looked at me you know, I was supposed to meet Senator Labetz and Schmidt for lunch after the funeral. And, you know, that's when I decided, I told my mom, you know, we're not going to do the Moors. We're going to hightail it out of Lincoln now.
Troy Bonner claims that pressure from the FBI and with the assistance of the county attorney's office in Omaha led him to swear a new statement claiming that he and Alicia Owen had concocted the entire child abuse story to the grand jury formed to bring any charges. On July the 23rd, 1990, the grand jury issued a bizarre and contradictory report. It indicted Larry King for fraud and embezzlement and ruled that he had paid young men for sex, but dismissed allegations about his sex ring. It indicted Alan Baer for the serious offense of pandering for sex, but rejected evidence linking him to King or to Citron, whom it noted had been convicted of separate child molestation charges. It accepted that Troy, Alicia, and Paul Bonacci had been abused, but not by the people they identified. And for refusing to withdraw her evidence, it charged Alicia Owen with perjury. Lawrence Schmidt's legislative committee issued a report denouncing the grand jury. Schmidt acknowledges that the system failed both the victims and him.
I had, I think, as distinguished a record as anyone could put together in 24 years. I was told that would be curtailed, and it was. I was told I'd have financial problems, and I did. The message was not lost on most politicians in Nebraska. I think the message that was delivered was if any legislative committee ever tries to conduct a thorough investigation again, the same thing will happen. It has shaken my faith in the institutions of government. I used to be a firm believer that the system would work, and that people who did things wrong would be punished. And we discovered victims who claimed to have been abused and who the grand jury acknowledged had been abused. But they did not try to find out who had abused those individuals. Instead, they convicted Alicia Owen of perjury. Indefensible from my point of view.
The trial took place in July 1991. Troy Bonner testified that the child abuse story had been an invention. As a result, Alicia Owen was sentenced to between 9 and 25 years in prison.
I can't find a case in the history of this country where some kid got sentenced to 25 or 30 years in prison for something like this. If you were going to pick a what I call a tell sign, something that says something fishy about the whole thing, it was in the sentencing itself. For some reason, they had to send a signal to every kid who was a potential witness. My opinion again. A signal so loud and clear, if you dare to come forward, if you dare to talk, watch what happens.
Alan Baer was fined $500 after pleading no contest to a reduced charge of aiding and abetting prostitution. Peter Citron served 2 years of a 3 to 8 year sentence. Thanks to Troy Bonner's lies, Larry King never faced child sex charges. For the $40 million fraud, he was given a 15-year sentence, 10 years less than Alicia Owen.
I feel really sick. I should be taken out and shot for doing that. And if that was to happen, I would go willingly.
John DeCamp, former state senator and Vietnam veteran, is now the only man fighting to help Larry King's victims. He is the lawyer trying to overturn Alicia Owen's conviction and to expose the cover-up.
I live in Nebraska. Hell, I was born here, raised here. I have 4 kids growing up here. Like it or not, it's my heritage, you know? Well, if it's a dirty cesspool that I gotta live in or look back on that I left, that ain't good. The real cost, if I were gonna say to my family, has been the fear and intimidation it's put in some of the kids. A couple of the kids are really, really frightened and really had some sleeping problems over it, you know, hear this or that. So that's been the real concern I've had.
John has received anonymous threats that has turned for advice to his friend and one-time boss, former head of the CIA, William Colby.
Well, Bill Colby told me better than anything. The one thing the bad people can't afford is publicity, and knocking you off right now or doing something obvious to one of your kids would bring them more trouble than it's worth.
I said, you have to consider the possibility of some danger to not only your reputation, but to your person. I mean, people do react rather violently to some kinds of charges, or particularly if they're true, there's more apt to be a negative reaction than if they're false. If they're false charges, then they can be reacted to in a normal way, by a libel suit or whatever. But if there's truth in it, there can be a danger in that situation. We've seen that happen in other cases.
John arranges to meet Troy Bonner, the young man he sees as the key to the cover-up.
He's in great danger. The reason is he carries the secret, so to speak. He served his purpose for the FBI and others by committing the lies that put the seal on the cover-up.
He knows that Troy's evidence will be crucial to Alicia Owen's case, and Troy wants to tell the truth, despite very real fears.
My fears are that, you know, I'm not going to be believed again. It's just, you know, going to be a whole other kind of exploitation like it was last time. You know, and afraid that that's going to happen, or, you know, I might end up dead, or a loved one might end up dead.
Troy has an overriding reason for putting the record straight.
Maybe somebody has a better idea.
I want this to go forward and have something done so that all those other kids who a lot worse things have happened to can come forward and see that action can be taken.
If you want to protect yourself and your life and your family's life, both now and particularly in the future, is to use the institutions of government that have been set up to protect you and make them work. That means you go into federal court, you go after the people that have done this cover-up, and you expose it so there's no longer any percentage on their part in eliminating you because the secret's out.
Yeah, that's why we're here today, to let it out.
John's advice to Troy to tell the truth in court puts him at risk of prosecution by the county attorney's office.
Potentially, they could decide to charge him with perjury, because now he is telling that they forced me to lie. I did lie at Alicia's trial. I did lie before the grand jury. I did it because the authorities were forcing me to do it, and I was scared for my family. Potentially, they could charge him with perjury this time.
Troy's appearance in court will keep Alicia Owen out of prison. She's on bail while DeCamp appeals against her perjury conviction. As her hearing approaches, vital new evidence emerges. Alicia claims that some of Troy's videotaped testimony was withheld from the grand jury which indicted her.
The tapes that were shown to the grand jury had been edited. Everything that matched Troy's statement
Shown.
that matched mine
I know it's
was
raised.
edited out. And I think maybe one of the things we want to do is show the judge specifically where these, you know, little 5-minute segments of, look, this tape says this, and then show him it isn't in this tape, and this is the tape the grand jury saw.
I'm going to attempt to get these tapes, and we'll see what happens next.
But to obtain the tapes, DeCamp must approach some of the very officials he has accused in court of being involved in the cover-up, the county attorney's office which ran the grand jury.
In the good old Alicia Owen case, 127-194, I'm trying to get the evidence, the tapes and the transcripts of Troy and Danny. Troy Bonner.
Get that up here once.
Yeah.
Look at the county attorneys. They have all the bills up there.
Robert, let me guess, Robert Siegler has them.
Robert Siegler is the prosecuting attorney trying to send Alicia Owen back to prison. After lengthy negotiations, DeCamp emerges with the tapes the grand jury never saw.
I went with $4,000 or about $4,000 of cocaine.
Okay, and what airline?
I flew out.
In more than 2 hours of taped testimony, Troy details trips across America on behalf of Larry King and Alan Baer. Trips for drug deals and sex. It corroborates Alicia's evidence.
Dallas Fort Worth, like an hour, and then a big plane from Dallas to Los Angeles.
Did anybody go with you?
Alicia Owen.
For John DeCamp, this is the proof of the King sex ring for which he has been waiting.
Here it is, so to speak, the smoking gun that they could go out and verify, the corroboration. In other words, the linkage to King that was denied. Cover-up. Organized, planned, deliberate cover-up.
The courthouse, Wahoo, Nebraska. The hearing begins. Alicia Owen is ready to testify. So is Paul Bonassi. But there is no sign of Troy Bonner. DeCamp discovers that Robert Siegler has sent the young man a subpoena. Fearing arrest for perjury, Troy has gone into hiding. DeCamp is without his most vital witness.
Try and subpoena him for these guys. Is Troy okay?
In court, Alicia's case is adjourned. The county attorney's office begins to search for Troy Bonner, but County Attorney Siegler won't say why.
Whether you're about to charge Troy Bonner with perjury?
Every victim witness who stepped forward in any way, or even was a potential witness that somebody heard about, has either been killed, put in jail under some theory or other, terrified or run out of the state, discredited. Every perpetrator, even the convicted ones, have been treated as conquering heroes.
Peter Citron lives in the same house where he abused many of his young victims. Alan Baer lives in the most exclusive part of Omaha. He recently bought a downtown shopping mall. Many of the other abusers named by the children have risen within Nebraska's state government and legal system and within the Republican Party.
Obviously, the FBI was protecting something a lot more significant than a bunch of old pedophiles having improper relations with little boys. They were protecting something a lot more significant than a bunch of drug peddlers. They were protecting, in my opinion, they were protecting some very prominent politicians, some very powerful and wealthy individuals associated with those politicians and the political system, up to and including the highest political people in this entire country.
In search of the men who protected Larry King, John DeCamp goes to Washington to investigate King's connections in the Republican Party and on Capitol Hill. Paul Bonassi provides him with the evidence that Larry King threw child sex parties here at his rented $5,000 a month Washington house.
I was about 14, about 1981. At first it was about 3 or 4 times the first year. After that, it was about once a month. Some of the parties, when they started off, were straight political type parties with no sex. And then when some of the men had left, some of the politicians had left, the ones that had planned on engaging in some type of sexual activity, that would come after the party. Some of the kids would be held downstairs in some of the rooms where if they acted up or if they started freaking out because of the drugs that they were on, they'd put them in a room that they couldn't get out of, and they'd lock them in.
What kind of drugs?
Anything you wanted. Cocaine, heroin, speedballs.
You're telling me those
speed.
things were at these parties where you had Larry King and prominent politicians?
Yes.
Were they readily available to anybody at the party?
At the after parties, they were readily available for anybody. Beforehand, they did it more upstairs than they did anywhere else, and it was kind of in the back rooms.
Were any attempts ever made that you know of to expose this situation?
As far as I know, nothing's ever been done, and most of the people that were in there had already been, I should say, compromised.
King's partner was Washington lobbyist Craig Spence. Spence took youngsters, including Bonassi, on private midnight tours of the White House.
So you were in the White House then?
Yes.
And how did you gain access?
Well, I came down with Larry King, but Craig Spence was the one that arranged the trip for us. And it was kind of a gift for our services that we were doing.
How many times were you on this kind of a trip?
I came to it on 2 times.
2 times. And were you used for sex on those occasions?
Not until after we left.
After you left the White House?
Yeah.
What time of night?
It was usually around midnight. For me, it was just kind of weird being in the White House at that time of the night, getting to go into places that the guy was telling us that nobody gets to go to. You know, I seen rooms in there that I'd never even heard about. Craig Spence and Larry King had a couple of groups. One was called Bodies by God, and they had the Cowboys, and there was another group that was started by Larry King, which was called the Golden Boys, which was kids that were usually under the age of approximately 10.
Spencer's callboy network was investigated in 1989 by reporter Paul Rodriguez of the Washington Times.
We had uncovered a series of allegations from some minors, and it led me to a callboy operation.
Well, it sure fits with, this boy Paul Bonassi. And he tells a tale of being brought to the White House on occasion, kind of as a reward for the kid.
Craig Spence is dead. He committed suicide. He had advanced stages of AIDS. He was an AIDS carrier, and he killed himself. This is the thing that always bothered me. They claimed it was the largest male prostitution ring in the city that they've ever had uncovered. It was $1 million a year minimum.
Yeah.
And yet they only prosecuted the operator, Henry Vinson, and 3 of his lieutenants, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
They never went after any of the Johns, or the clients. This operation claimed to have clients that ran from the White House to the Capitol Hill to the State House to the churches within the media.
Exactly what Paul describes as the people he was with.
And a lot of the stuff led there, but we couldn't quite nail it at all cases because, again, to accuse someone of high stature, you've got to be very careful.
I understand.
We were able to do it through the mother lode was provided us credit card receipts and canceled checks, and then lists of the clients. The prosecutors knew all this stuff. There was approximately 20,000 documents they had. They sealed the entire record by court order, and we've attempted on several occasions to unseal that, and we've been told it will be a cold day in hell before those records ever get unsealed. And it makes me wonder what's in those records.
Yeah.
John DeCamp believes that the legal system is still being subverted and that the people protected are still at the heart of the American establishment. He hopes that this program will expose a serious miscarriage of justice, but the opposition is formidable.
It's beyond belief that arguably the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, in the form of Richard Nixon, could not prevent the investigation of Watergate, or that President Reagan could not prevent the investigation of Iran-Contra. And yet somehow this group of unnamed, unknown, anonymous individuals in Omaha, Nebraska have such power they can control and protect all of these people from being investigated. Those allegations are ridiculous.
Well, first of all, Nixon did cover up Watergate. Number 1. Bush did cover up Iran-Contra, at least officially. And Omaha has successfully covered up this situation.
In each case, it was the press that exposed the problem. It wasn't institutions of government. They had been corrupted. They had been compromised. They were the ones doing the cover-up.
The Attorney General is now involved. De Camp's evidence has been passed by William Colby to a senior lawyer in the Justice Department.
He did say that the Attorney General's office would be very sensitive to any charges of abuse of children, that this was a matter of considerable priority to the department, that this sort of thing not take place, and that they would assign an officer to look into the case.
For John De Camp, the story of Larry King's corrupt empire holds a dire warning for all America.
If you can control about 3 or 4 key elements, you can totally own a state. You can make right wrong. You can make truth falsehood, falsehood truth. If you control the media, if you control the Justice Department, if you control the police, you own the system.
That's healthy. Okay. We're ready to go, okay? Now, you've seen the video Conspiracy of Silence. Does anybody have any questions about this video?
That video, was that, it said at the end, it was sent to John DeCamp about a year after the thing ended. In other words, these were all pictures taken by people opposed to John DeCamp.
No, this footage was a company from York, named Yorkshire, out of northern England.
Yes.
Read the book, believed it, and came over to investigate and interview all these people. They've investigated people and interviewed people who were covering it up. They interviewed people that didn't believe what happened. They interviewed people who were victims of it. They interviewed people who were investigating it. They interviewed hundreds of people for this, what you see, 1 hour. Like I said, they spent between $250,000 and $500,000 just spent 10 months because they had an unlimited budget almost, and that's why they travel all over the nation interviewing people. So now, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I lost track of that Yorkshire thing.
Okay, right. Any other questions?
Yeah, about the thing about the school, the first stuff we saw this evening, I've heard that...
Well, let's stick with this first. Keep it in context, then we'll go back to the school, okay? Anybody have any more questions about the video or the book? Yes, Joe?
Still wanted to point out, the thing on Colby, they didn't get into that part. Colby actually told John DeCamp, and this is on his video, the Franklin cover-up, which we've got on. I think you've got copies of that.
Yes, we do.
And maybe in his book.
4 or 5.
But anyway, the Franklin cover-up, John DeCamp was told by Colby to get this information out, just like he was telling, what's his name, you know, you got to get it out into the system and all that, otherwise, yeah, you're a dead person. Well, what happened to Colby? Do you guys know who Colby is?
Yeah, he had deceased.
Okay, what happened? Do you guys know what happened to him?
He's deceased now.
Yeah, and he was, this is John DeCamp, if I recall this correctly, from the standpoint he was after breakfast, so to speak, but actually...
After a meal.
After a meal, but actually, everything was just dropped, which normally would not have happened, and he suddenly decides to get his nerves brought in his rowboat or his canoe and go down the river and he disappeared.
With his computer on and
Lights on in the house.
Lights on the house and everything.
and he was supposedly an extremely fastidious person.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I did read that, and I forgot.
Yeah.
Right. And DeCamp also told us that this man did not just go for a boat ride in his canoe. He said that I've been with him many times at the cabin as we discussed different sections of the segments of the French. And he would get, John DeCamp would bounce things off of him and they would go out and investigate. The reason well, I'll tell you about what happened to him, and then I'll tell you a little background, okay, why it happened. Colby was not only a perfectionist, as DeCamp said, he was really fanatical about it, all right, to the point that he wouldn't leave the house if one hair was out of place. And yet we're supposed to believe that the door was left unlocked, lights on, half meal of it on the table, computer on, and two more important things. Think about it. A man that meticulous and fastidious always wore a life jacket, but he didn't have one on. And also he always put his flag up on his canoe. No flag up. And then DeCamp says on the video that we've got, we'll show it here in the next few weeks, he said that they had one of the biggest search parties in the history of the nation and the world looking for this man. Former head of the CIA, you know, is in the Potomac and he disappears.
Yeah, they can't find his body, it's an accident.
Right, can't find his body. He said they must have gone by, then about 10 days later they found his body on shore. Washed up on the shore, they said. He said they must have gone by that site 1,000 times. It wasn't there. Ted Gunderson told me that he has on good authority, and good because these guys have got good people inside the CIA, lots of good people in the FBI, and yeah, and Ted Gunderson, good point, is former head of the FBI in Memphis, in Dallas, and Los Angeles, second largest office in the country, 27 plus years he served his country. I just talked to him today for about a half an hour. I just talked to DeCamp 2 days ago for a quiet time. The point is that Gunderson said he has on good authority that they tortured Colby for 4 days before they killed him. Can you imagine that? Why? Because, why? Well, you have to draw your own conclusions, okay? Here's one of the reasons, all right? A month after Polly Klaas's body was found, all right, this story came out, front page of the U.S. News and World Report, exposing what? CIA torture labs in America, okay? And it said on the next, it was a 5-page story, and it says that they used thousands of American citizens as their victims. It describes the kinds of torture, in many cases, the military bases, the hospitals where they did the experiments, all this, and it talks about what they were doing. Mind control. All we heard about was radiation. Remember hearing about the radiation? And Clinton formed the commission to investigate the radiation. But we never heard about the mind control. Why not? Why didn't we hear about the fact that they used chemicals and drugs on these people? And these children right here are victims of the same thing. She never mentions CIA in this video. It never mentions who was in the White House at the time these children were taken to the White House for the sex parties. It never mentions who was the vice president. It doesn't mention lots of things that we're going to talk about next week. Next Friday we're going to be back.
So what? Your question is, who am I? My name is John DeCamp. I guess you described me as a worn-out politician and a sometime lawyer and father of a mess of children, husband of a little Vietnamese boat person refugee named Na, and kind of peripherally at least involved in the so-called Patriot movement as a result of some of the cases I've worked on over the years. So let's see, worn-out politician. For about 16 years, I was a Nebraska state senator. In fact, if you go back and check the records or even the internet, I guess, you'll you'll see that I was probably one of the most, if not the most controversial senator for a number of years, and one of the most effective, even according to some of my worst enemies, the Omaha World Herald newspaper, for example. And I think I have probably the record for one of the most unusual racist. Let's see. My entire campaign was run from a place called Vietnam during a war called the Vietnam War, and I won the election without ever setting foot in the United States. I was a combat infantry captain in Vietnam at the time, and working on my assignments over there, some kind of strange things. Came back here, became a state senator, and of course kept my law practice going and a number of other businesses, from banks to insurance to land development to agriculture to construction company to you name it. And here about 10 years ago, I think it is, almost 10 years exactly, I left the legislature and became pretty active then running a law firm. I have half a dozen lawyers here in my little firm in Nebraska that work for me, under me, with me, against me, whatever. And I live in a little town 30 miles south of Lincoln, Nebraska, a little town called Claytonia, Nebraska. And that pretty much sums up my life. I've been a candidate for governor, where I managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory at the critical moment when the polls showed me ahead, and I guess I'm still trying to figure that one out on some of these electronic voting machines, but that's a story for another day. That's about it. That's me, John DeCamp. Do you want to know how I got involved in... Okay. Well, let's see. How did I ever become involved in this so-called patriot movement and representing militia and free men and people involved in the Oklahoma bombing and just you name it? It goes back a ways. About 10 years ago, yeah, it'd be almost 10 years ago, after I was out of the legislature, I was attorney for a senator called Senator Loren Schmidt, and some events occurred here in Nebraska that had nationwide repercussions. A black man by the name of Larry King, officially identified as the fastest rising star in the, or black star in the Republican Party at the time. In fact, some of you folk, if you remember, if you went to the, or watched on television, the Republican National 84 and then the Republican National Convention 1988, Larry King was the big man, big black man you saw opening both of those national conventions, the Republican national conventions, by singing the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. Well, on Election Day, 1988, Larry King, who in his private life supposedly had a small minority credit union over in North Omaha, which he was supposedly helping the community with loans. Larry King's little credit union was raided by federal officials, and they discovered that there was apparently a problem there. One of the problems was this little $2 million credit union had a secret set of books that showed another $40 million had come in from a variety of sources, from Boys Town to Union Pacific Railroad to ConAgra, some of the biggest corporations in America, that had funneled into there and had disappeared. And Larry, it seems, didn't have any good explanations and didn't acknowledge that he had even gotten this money. Well, as things developed on this little credit union called the Franklin Credit Union that Larry ran, as things evolved, the legislature thought it should do an investigation into whether something went wrong with the laws or whether laws needed to be changed or this or that. And as their investigation got going, and I was the attorney for one of the senators, the chairman of that committee, Senator Schmidt, as things got going, strange stories started floating out from children on the streets to other places, particularly some of these young kids that yeah, they knew Larry King, and yeah, he was a big man on campus. They had ridden with him in his private jets and to his mansion in Washington, D.C., where they had participated in sex orgies and with some of the most famous politicians and businessmen whose names you'd immediately recognize. Well, more and more of these stories started coming out, and more strange things about Larry's credit union. And as I say, Larry, of course, denied this, but the stories kept getting stronger, and I was one of the first ones, I'll be honest, I was one of the first ones to say, you know, this is nonsense. These tales are so unbelievable that some of these people are coming forward with that they should be rejected out of hand. They just aren't credible. And then I said something else. I said, and if I really believed any of this, I'd be the first one to stand up and say, hey, let's do some prosecuting. Let's lock some people up. Let's correct the situation. Let's get the story out. And, well, as things shaped up, make a long story short, I became convinced after a while that there really was a lot of truth to these stories, and I ended up representing some of these children involved, and just an ever-escalating thing on a national level. The story became basically a story of a very, very horrible and very large ring of people that used children for drug couriers, some of the most prominent names and businessmen in this country, that it was being covered up and protected because some of the people involved high law enforcement, FBI people wouldn't do their part because some of them were involved. Just one horrible thing after another. And when the dust had finally settled, I went and sat down with my very, very good friend, mentor, advisor, guide, a man named Bill Colby, who you folk may remember. Bill Colby used to be the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was the man I worked directly for in Vietnam. Officially, he was ambassador over there at the time, but in fact, he really was head of the CIA then, at least in Vietnam, for the Vietnam operations during the war. But anyway, I sat down with Bill, and make a long story short, Bill basically told me to get away from all this, that it was so much bigger and so much more deadly and dangerous, and where it led and what it involved than anything I ever imagined. And that if I stuck around trying to do something about it, I'd get myself and my family probably killed or worse. And I said, well, what can I do? I can't just walk away. He said, I'll tell you what. The only way, really, on these kind of things, because of where it goes and what it involves, the only way you can probably both protect yourself and try to do something about it may not be in the manner you want, but it's the manner it's going to have to be done eventually. You're going to have to get the national press involved in exposing these things, get it so reported and so looked into that it can't be covered up, because the forces you're against are just too big and too powerful for you to do them in the time you want or the way you want, and you keep it up, you're going to end up dead. So I went home, wrote the book, The Franklin Cover-Up, which pretty well details the story from A to Z, and that was my beginning of involvement in, let's say, criticizing some elements of government and asking for some reform and trying to point out through very clear documentation some of these problems and how dangerous it is if we get institutions of government corrupted. As a result of that book, and this has taken a long time to get to a simple answer to a simple question, as a result of that book, received some calls and some attention from some groups around the country that read the book. I did not spend a penny, by the way, advertising the book, but it sold over 50,000 copies. As a result of that book, I got contacted, for example, by some group called the Militia of Montana here a few years ago. And when I heard what was going on with them, I agreed to look into it. I thought, a bunch of nuts here that rabble-rousing, but...
John?
Yeah?
Tara's on line 4. She's looking for her sister Shannon.
Oh, Militia of Montana. So I agreed to look into it. I checked on it, and I found that there were 7 of these individuals up in Montana were arrested and charged with something called criminal syndicalism. And the more I checked, the more I found out that there was absolutely no basis for their arrest. That what they were being arrested for was who they associated with and the beliefs they held or expressed. Not any violence, not any threats of violence or anything else, but simply their speech, free speech. And I got into a big battle with the Attorney General and the officials in Montana, but when all the dust had settled, we won the case and got every one of the charges dismissed of this nonsensical criminal syndicalism laws against these individuals. And that got me a bit of a reputation in the entire, I guess you'd call it the patriot community at that time, which was beginning fairly rapidly this few years ago to develop a pretty good network of communication via the fax and via the shortwave radio and so on. The next major event that occurred that kind of impacted everything was immediately after the victory in the Militia of Montana case and the Freemen. I guess they had some group called the Freemen who were also involved in that group that I represented. The next event was something called the Oklahoma City bombing, almost immediately after I won dismissal. And as a result of that, I was asked to represent some of the individuals that were injured, and eventually I ended up representing the grand juror, Hoppy Heidelberg. Hoppy Heidelberg was the grand juror who indicted and voted to indict McVeigh and Nichols, but who also stepped forward and said, wait a minute, we got to indict McVeigh and Nichols, but that's only half the story. My duty as a grand juror, Hoppy's position was, my duty as a grand juror is to find out the whole truth of what happened, and I'm being prevented from doing that. And in fact, I'm being threatened. And of course, eventually the judge removed Hoppy from the grand jury, and I represented him, made sure that they didn't attempt anything else. So that case, a number of others, have led me, so to speak, to represent some of these groups and become pretty deeply involved, at least, in trying to learn just how big and large and wide and fat and noisy and whatever the entire animal is. Subsequent to that, I took all the militia leaders from across the United States before the United States Senate hearings, and we had one demand. We all agreed in advance we would have one demand in return for them fulfilling that demand. In return for the Senate, Senator Specter was the one that reached the agreement with us. I would bring all militia leaders they wanted from across the United States, Michigan, Montana, you name it. We would answer any and every question that they could put to us. Remember, this is shortly after Oklahoma, when they're saying the militia did this and militia this, and they had the whole world making it believe that the militia were ready to blow up the universe or something, when the truth was, as I explained, and as I'll repeat again, the truth was one gang on a Saturday night in Los Angeles does more damage than all the militias across the country have from the beginning of the militia movement. But anyway, we made our one demand in return for answering everything, doing anything they wanted, agreeing even to take lie detector tests on any answer that any of these militia leaders gave. What was our demand? Our demand was that the Senate reopen hearings into Waco and Ruby Ridge. That was our agreement. We'll come forward and testify, give you any answers. I'll represent them and bring them here. You, the Senate, agree to hold hearings on Waco and Ruby Ridge and look into those things, because we don't think the American people are getting the total truth. Well, I don't need to go into that much more. The rest is history. The hearings did occur. A lot of bad things were found out, and they go on today. So that's kind of how I got involved in this whole thing of representing some of these groups and maybe seeing both sides and kind of acting as an intermediary, if you would, between the judicial system on occasion and the Patriot movement, between the government on occasion and the Patriot movement, trying to force some integrity and justice into some of the systems. I've got some cases still in Montana and some of the other places where they're using abusive laws to try to lock people up, and are locking them up for what they say, what they believe, and what they think. The very opposite of what the First Amendment's all about. Anyway, as I understand your question, you're wondering, well, as a result of this whole Franklin thing I got involved in, was it anything more than just I raised the question myself, anything more than a bunch of locally playing with each other and trying to cover up some of their sins and being involved with some kids? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, that's how, as I say, I ended up writing the book, because it went so far beyond anything here. It involved a true... Who's there? It involved a true national network of very bad behavior by some of the most powerful politicians and businessmen in this country. And I name in the book, and I document very clearly from A to Z. And the second book I wrote, that just came out here about 4 or 5 years after that first book, takes the story from the original book and finishes it up. What's happened to these people? What's happened to the girl, for example, Alicia Owen, that dared to stand up and tell what had happened to her as a young child? What's happened to some of the boys that testified? For example, a young man named Paul Benassi, who identified all kinds of horrible things from his earliest age on. He got involved in from some of this mind control stuff that the government was experimenting with at the time, which people don't want to believe existed, just like we don't want to believe a lot of things that the government unfortunately has done and then had to fess up to later, but something called the Monarch Project, which wasn't even the real name. That was the name the kids came to know by a government program that played around with their minds and was going to use kids as anti-terrorist devices and would-be saboteurs to penetrate other countries and this type of thing. But the story itself, as I say, went so far beyond, quote, Nebraska or Omaha. For example, Larry King, the black man I've identified in the book and who's now in prison on other things, by the way, he maintained a $5,000 a month mansion on Embassy Row in Washington where he brought the children and flew them in, and like the kids were saying, and they're his private Lear jets, and would have these incredible parties. And there's nothing more effective or more powerful to control a politician or a prominent businessman than to have them provided a sexual tryst or some drugs or a combination thereof, particularly with some underage child or young girl or boy or manifest homosexual proclivities that are recorded secretly on film that are then used to compromise this or that politician or businessman. And that's where the Franklin cover-up story started, and as I say, it's led me into all these other things, and there's always the tendency or concern on my part or anybody's part, well, are you one of those nut network people that start talking this conspiracy theory and that conspiracy theory and that one? I have tried to be extremely cautious on that, and so anything I say in the book, anything and everything, I have a document for. For example, when the first book came out, the first reaction, the absolute first reaction of a number of people that were named in the book and their lawyers was to issue public statements saying I was going to be sued in the biggest libel and defamation suits ever, and I would be broke and disbarred and everything else, and there have been more than a few attempts to hurt and punish me. However, there's only been one lawsuit out of that book. That was when I sued Atlantic Telecast Company over in Wilmington, North Carolina, an East Coast television company, for them daring to go on television and saying that the book was not true. And I found out later that the police chief from Omaha, who's clearly identified by me in the book, a man named Wadman, is involved in all this with the Alicia Owen girl and so on. I found out he had gone to the Wilmington people and said, oh, this is all. So I sued them. And at first they, of course, said, no, we aren't going to do anything. You're wrong, we're right. Well, within 3 weeks they had done some of their own investigation. They backed down and paid me a financial settlement, as well as had then a public apology 3 nights running as the lead story on their news, apology to the senator from Nebraska, and acknowledged the book was accurate. So the Franklin cover-up itself goes way, way, way beyond, quote, Omaha, Nebraska. It does describe this national network. It does identify a lot of the politicians, some frightening things you don't want to hear from Iran-Contra. That book was, by the way, the first place to identify the Iran-Contra connection, the George Bush potential involvement in some of these things, at least if not his involvement, his tacit approval in some of his key positions from a former head of the CIA. By the way, he's the one that replaced my friend Bill Colby. When Colby was fired, George Bush replaced him and became the head of the CIA. But anyway, from Bush to you name it in the White House or Congress, the book spills it all out and spells it out and documents it. And then the second book, of course, deals with some of the other things I mentioned, from the Oklahoma bombing, where I represent the folk there, to these militia cases. And I guess if there be an essence or a general theme throughout, it is we all as Americans want to love our government. We want to believe in our government. We want those things we grew up with knowing were true to actually be true, and we're finding contradictory evidence one after another, where instead of, quote, government being the servant of the people, it's become the master, and where instead of our revered institutions of government being pure as the driven snow, we find that the snow has been pretty heavily laden with some black soot, and you wonder what can be done about it and how you're going to go about doing something about it, and just how deep it goes, and is it just an isolated instance, or is it Or is it endemic to the system? Has corruption in government become endemic to the system to the point where you got real problems? And you got to remember, people love to babble and chatter about, oh, democracy and this and American system that and so on and so forth. But you got to remember one thing. Our system of government doesn't guarantee freedom necessarily. Our system of government doesn't guarantee that you're going to be rich or poor. You know, the only thing that really is unique about our system as compared with all other systems that have ever been invented in history, the only really single characteristic that's different than all the rest is it's the only self-correcting system ever invented, ever created. The only self-correcting. When the pendulum swings too far one way, without the bullet, without the bombs, without the revolution, it, quote, self-corrects and starts swinging back the other way. And that's the beauty of our system, that it is self-correcting, and it's worked a dozen times over the 225 years or so of our history. Well, I think we're at one of those critical times now where the correction has to occur, and unfortunately the correction may be inhibited quite a bit because the thing that it's supposed to correct, that the system is supposed to correct, the government itself, has become so all-powerful, so all-controlling, and unfortunately in some cases so abusive and repressive of some of the very things that need to occur to correct, which is First Amendment rights, this type of thing. And so when you have people speak out, whether they be free men or militias or people here on the far right or far left, when they speak out and criticize the government, they're immediately, in any of the media these days, the first thing you see is anti-government, and the labels. They'll have these individuals who might just be saying they think President Clinton is wrong or corrupt on something or done something wrong. They'll immediately have a litany of anti-government, blah, 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 tax protest. However, if it's a Republican, let's say Newt Gingrich, saying the identical things, they don't say he's anti-government. They don't say he's this, he's that. All they say is Republican House leader, whatever. My point is they've tried to kind of suppress the very things that make the system self-correct, and it really concerns me because we do know the self-correction needs to occur, but we're seeing too much now the handicapping or the suppressing of the key tools or elements that have made it self-correct in the past. You have to understand the character of a Bill Colby. Now, Bill Colby was raised as a Catholic, super strict. His entire life was rigidly following rules. He was truly this country's greatest spy master, but he also had some pretty strict rules. He saw the war he had conducted, the Cold War, as just as significant as World War II or World War I, maybe even more significant, because the things were beneath the surface most of the time as to what was occurring. It was a war conducted by the CIA and the intelligence community, and during that process, a lot of things developed and were allowed to develop necessarily, at least they thought they were necessary, that are kind of incompatible or don't work good with a free and open society. You know, covert operations and doing this. And Bill was smart enough to realize that itself was a very danger, creating this system where you had almost a secret government, which he acknowledged had effectively occurred. I think would be a fair statement. And therefore, I think he felt a certain duty to be one of those who, since he was so intimately involved in that creation, also the correcting of it and making sure there were, quote, constitutional safeguards and political safeguards and popular safeguards against the existence and creation and control by a secret system or set of governments there. And one of the things, the primary thing Bill was doing the last years of his life, in fact, I was with him literally 2 weeks before his alleged falling out of a canoe and dying. I was with him 2 weeks, and we had a very good chat. It was like, I think it was just after his 75th birthday, and he was in the best health. He had completed a physical and was in the best health ever. And I asked him, I said, Bill, what would you say would be the happiest 5 years of your life if you were going to pick a period in history? 5 years, maybe back during World War II when you were leading the secret attempts to get into Germany or head of the CIA or what? He said, I'll tell you what, John. He said, the last 5 years and the next 5 years. And I said, wait a minute, why? Because I'm really doing what I enjoy now, and even more than that, what I think can really make a difference in the world. You remember, this is the man that was over there with Yeltsin when they were having the collapse of the Russian Empire and the coup or push or putsch or whatever you call them. He was with Yeltsin, believe it or not, right when this was occurring, in Russia here a few years ago. Well, anyway, what he was doing now was traveling all over the world, meeting with world leaders and top business leaders from around the world, and giving his analysis of where we were in the world and where they were and how the pieces were fitting together. He was the best individual there was when it came to looking out and seeing the road of the future, what's happening, how the pieces are going to fit into place. And that's what he enjoyed, traveling all over the world, meeting with these people, giving them some direction and input based on a lifetime of knowing what's going on both behind the scenes and under the covers and on top of the covers, and how the two sometimes fit and how they don't fit. So he was in absolutely the best shape he'd ever been, the best mood he'd ever been, and that's what he was planning to do and had been doing. And so he said the last 5 years and the next 5 years. So here I'm listening to the radio and television a couple weeks later, and supposedly he's violated every single rule that he followed all his life. In other words, walking out at night, canoeing, which he didn't particularly enjoy, leaving his food on the table, television and computers on. Come on, the man never had a hair out of place if anybody followed his character. I mean, so when they tell me that he goes out under these conditions, falls out of his canoe, then drowns and can't be found for 10 days, and then 10 days or whatever it is later, they find him in exactly the spot they searched 1,000 times, but he wasn't found there. I say, right. And then I say exactly what Bill always used to say, if it's done right, you'll never know who did it or why. And in this case, in my own mind, absolutely do not believe the man went out, fell out of his canoe, and drowned. And I believe that for whatever reason, he was a thorn in somebody's side, and he had to be shut up, and that's what occurred. Well, the question has been raised as to whether there was any incentive or desire on the part of our U.S. Justice Department, in other words, recently and currently headed by Janet Reno, to look into matters of the Franklin thing. Colby himself, and I have the letter, Colby himself personally went to Janet Reno, gave her some background on the subject, personally asked and was promised that the Justice Department would look into it, investigate, and work and cooperate with me on that. In fact, Bill got a letter back from them assuring him of that. To the best of my knowledge, not one thing was ever done. Now, why that was, I don't know. I'm sure there could be a dozen explanations, but I do know they, at the highest levels, Janet Reno herself, Colby went and asked personally, based on his background, that something be done, and was promised in writing it would be, and to the best of my knowledge, it never has been. Now, which raises the question of the Justice Department itself. Is it functioning like it should? And I guess that's one of the key elements in my new book. And by the way, my new book, The Franklin Cover-Up, is the revised edition, which is the entire first book, an entirely new book dealing with Oklahoma and the Freemen and the militias, the Patriot movement, the follow-up to the original Franklin thing, a lot of these things. But in the new book, I try to select half a dozen, for example, key cases of very national prominence handled by our Justice Department, wherein it is clear, not by my stating it, not by my even saying, I think this, but by the judgments of the system itself, the courts themselves involved, that our Justice Department has done the precise opposite of what it was created to do. instead of protecting and following the rule of law, they have in fact become the users and abusers of the rule of law. And as I say, I list a variety of cases from the far right to the far left, where you would have to say in all honesty or disagree with the individuals involved. For example, the LaRouche case I cite, because it is so well documented that here was a guy that was a thorn in the butts of a lot of high government officials, to the point where he was beginning to be able to impact the political system, which is what it's all about. That's how the pendulum starts swinging back, when somebody on the noisy right or the noisy left or whatever starts raising issues, and it makes people think and look, and they start slowly swinging. Their solution to this man was simply to lock him up, set him up. Okay, then you pick the case of the Monjuk case, I think it was, where the court system at the highest levels finally said this is a fraud perpetrated on the American people, you know, just because they wanted to accommodate the Israeli lobby, you know. And I cite case after case where our Justice Department has been the abuser of the rule of law rather than the enforcer of it. And whenever a system where its key piece, the justice, your justice system is the thing that makes all the rest of the clock tick and the parts go in synchronous, when your key driving force gets corrupted, you've got problems. And that's what I think I see occurring too often now in this country. And so when we take the Franklin case, which really covers the entire spectrum of all these cases on a grand level, and where it leads, and you get a promise and a commitment from the Justice Department to look into it, and they do the precise opposite, I think it is one more reflection of how serious it's become. And again, because you, quote, see a rotten spot in your government, and you say, well, let's correct it. That doesn't mean you're anti-government. It doesn't mean you're evil or a radical or a crazy or a nut or far right or far left. What it means is you love your system. You love, you know, a clean government, and you want to make sure it doesn't get any more contaminated. But the way it's shaped up and evolving now, anybody that dares speak out is either suppressed, labeled as a nut, or anti-government, and the thing that they're trying to expose or correct is in fact sanctified, ratified, and approved, and leads on to even more grievous problems for the future. And that's what's occurring too frequently now. The argument is always given, if you can just disarm the people, and of course there's 1,000 historical comparisons and scenarios, and the one they like to present or paint the most is the famous one when Germany, one of the first things was disarm the populace. Therefore, if you need to shut them up or shut somebody down, you don't have that serious problem with somebody being able to resist, at least forcefully, with any arms. Oh, it's a boiling problem. I can sure see the opposite side of the equation too. The typical American in the 1990s and the year 2000, their only contact with a gun is what they see on television of people shooting, and we have an urban population as opposed to an agrarian population. Their only contact with anybody with guns is when they see the Saturday night news and the gang shooting each other up, or somebody robbing a bank or whatever. And it's real difficult to reconcile your Second Amendment rights, and remember, it is a right, your Second Amendment rights with most of the people seeing the so-called gun grabbers, as they would view the government, most of the people on the other side of that equation, the ones that hold guns, whether for defense or recreation or hunting or sporting activities, most of those people, when they see the government or legislation, they believe, I think most of them believe very sincerely, that there's a, quote, hidden agenda of government. If you can just disarm the population or control the gun supply close enough so that you know who's got a gun, where they have, everything about them, then anytime you want to implement something as a government, you don't have to worry about that faction being able to resist it. I guess my personal opinion is the real battle over this issue has not come yet by a long way. I do believe there is a segment of the government, I'm completely satisfied there's a segment of the government that wants to disarm the population for the reasons that I don't think are warranted. That is to make sure nobody can resist government. I think there's another very, very sincere and honest segment of government that is trying to grapple with this problem of the Saturday night specials and the guns and the murders and the criminals, and they simply don't know how to best do it. It's a battle that hasn't yet occurred. It's only beginning to take shape, and it's going to get a lot more acute and severe. I would point out, as I have in political speeches, that if you take all the murders and killings and everything else that are going on and have gone on with guns, you're going to be hard-pressed. You're going to be awfully hard-pressed to find, as I pointed out to Ted Koppel on his Nightline one time. I said, in fact, I'll sit here and you tell me, Ted. I said, give me a list. Give me a list of all the terrorist acts and murders committed by all the militia people you can identify in the last 10 or 15 years. And I said, and I'll guarantee you one thing. All of them totaled up. All of them totaled up. Won't amount to as many killings as occur in Los Angeles on a typical Saturday night from just the gang wars. And I guess that really is my point in this whole thing. There's this dichotomy and difficulty of resolving the right to bear arms issues. The people wanting to bear arms aren't the ones wanting them for improper purposes, yet they're the ones that they're trying to take all the arms away from. The ones that really are the problem, somehow the efforts aren't directed at them or don't seem to be very effective. So I don't know where this battle is headed, but it's not over. But it's merely a symptom. That's what we don't see. It's merely a symptom of the overall problem of what has reached almost a warlike condition between at least a certain segment of the population and the government in their attitude and philosophy. We know now, not from me saying it or you or anybody else, we know from CNN, USA Today, the Republican Party official polls, the Democratic Party official polls, we know officially that 76% of the American people, the John Does and the Mary Rose, we know that 76%, that's more than 3 out of every 4 Americans, no longer, quote, trust or believe that their government is telling the truth to them when the government gives them their official story or report or the official government version on something, whether it be plane crashes or wartime events or one thing or another. 3 out of 4 Americans no longer believe their own government when they get their official report. Now, that's dangerous for this reason. And by the way, officially that's the highest percentage, since they've ever been keeping these polls, the highest percentage in American history of American